At age 62, Charles Oakley was once one of the clearest icons of the NBA in the 1980s, 1990s, a player not measured by points but by his willingness to sacrifice. Over 19 NBA seasons, Oakley played in 1,282 games, scored more than 12,400 points, grabbed nearly 12,000 rebounds, and ranks among the most consistently durable rebounders in league history. He was selected as an NBA All-Star in 1994, made the NBA All-Defensive First Team 1994, and NBA All-Defensive Second Team 1998, and was honored with the NBA All-Rookie First Team in 1986 right in his rookie season. Oakley was one of the very few non-centers to lead the NBA in total rebounds multiple times in a season, representing the type of player who built the foundation rather than stood in the spotlight. In a Chicago Bulls uniform, he was the direct protector for Michael Jordan in those early career years. In a New York Knicks uniform, he became the soul of an era of brutal basketball, helping lead the team to the NBA Finals in 1994 and deep into the Eastern Conference playoffs multiple times. Oakley never owned an NBA championship ring, but he possessed something very few players ever earn: the absolute respect of teammates and the wariness of opponents. His legacy isn't in flashy titles, but in becoming the standard for the enforcer role, the one who takes the hits, keeps order and protects the team's values in an era when honor mattered more than image. Yet, when looking back at those numbers, those awards, the irony of Oakley's life becomes painfully clear. Because today, no arena, no honorary bench seat, no official tribute ceremony awaits him. A legend who played over 1,000 NBA games, who was an all-star, who stood in the NBA Finals, now exists on the margins of collective memory. Oakley's pain doesn't come from lacking a championship ring, but from the long silence after all the sacrifices have been made. His body carries the marks of nearly 2 decades of collisions, with joint and spine pain becoming his daily companion every morning. But what weighs on him most is the feeling of being forgotten in the very story he helped write. Even so, Oakley doesn't seek pity. He doesn't bow his head to be remembered, doesn't apologize to be forgiven. The will that carried him through nearly 20 years in the NBA is still there, accepting not being called upon, but never denying what he did, because some men don't need a final title to prove they paid the full price for glory. If you want to keep exploring the hidden corners behind the Charles Oakley legend, where honor, loyalty, and loneliness intertwine throughout a lifetime, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this story. Cleveland isn't a place where people grow up with gentle dreams, and Charles Oakley's childhood had no soft cushions to fall into. It was a poor black working-class neighborhood, where winters dragged on like a warning, where violence wasn't an exception but the daily rhythm, and where kids learned to duck trouble before they even understood what protection meant. Charles was born into a big family where money was always short and attention even shorter. No one had time to listen to a boy complain about being tired, and no one had enough to spare to ask what that boy was afraid of. In Cleveland back then, emotions were a luxury. To survive, you had to be tough, and Charles Oakley learned to be tough very early. His childhood wasn't filled with carefree afternoons in the park, but with streets where police sirens were as familiar as the wind, where a weak glance could become an excuse to be tested. Charles learned to take hits before he learned to dream. That boy understood that if he wasn't strong enough, the world would crush him without apology. School wasn't a refuge, just another space of pressure. Teachers had no time for every kid. Friends were busy surviving too. In that crowd, Charles wasn't noticed for talent, but for his silence and the way he stood firm when pushed. Basketball entered Charles's life not as a shining dream, but as a means of survival. The court wasn't paradise, but the only place that let him release all the built-up fear, anger, and helplessness. There, the rules were clearer than on the streets. The stronger one stands, the weaker one gets eliminated. Charles wasn't the flashiest scorer, but he was the one who never backed down. Every collision was a quiet declaration: I'm still here. No one taught him to dream of the NBA. No one told him basketball could take him far. He just knew that on the court he wasn't the forgotten kid anymore. That lack of affection didn't break Charles. It made him accustomed to not being chosen, not being called. Cleveland taught him that if you wait for recognition, you'll starve. If you wait for gentleness, you'll freeze. So Charles built himself a thick shell, not to show off, but to avoid more hurt. In those long nights of the poor neighborhood, when streetlights cast shadows on tired faces, the young Oakley developed a survival instinct. No one needs to pity him, he just needs to be strong enough to keep going. It was from that place with no room for childhood that the seed of a man used to being left behind began to grow. Charles Oakley didn't carry warm memories into life, he carried endurance, and that endurance, painful as it was, became the foundation for everything he would face later. Cleveland didn't give him dreams, but it gave him something harder, the toughness to survive in a world that never yields. Leaving Cleveland didn't mean stepping into the light, and when Charles Oakley arrived at Virginia Union, he quickly realized the bigger world wasn't any gentler. That small HBCU school had no TV cameras, no NBA scouts filling the stands, no newspaper articles praising young talent. Virginia Union was a quiet place, almost invisible on the U.S. college basketball map, and Oakley, no matter how dominant, was just a name floating in that silence. On the court he dominated with strength, endurance and relentless battling. Off the court hardly anyone knew who he was. Rebound numbers climbed, wins piled up, but no promises came with them for the future. No spotlight, no cheers, no sense that he was getting closer to the dream. At Virginia Union, Oakley did everything a player could to prove his worth: protect the paint, take the hits, shield teammates, play the heaviest minutes without complaint. He became the irreplaceable pillar of the team, but the bitter truth was that the pillar of an unknown team is still an invisible pillar. Stars from big schools got mentioned in the press, dissected move by move. Oakley didn't. He learned a quiet but profound lesson: doing well is never enough to be seen. Value without the right context can be buried in silence with no one bothering to mourn it. That feeling wasn't new to Oakley. Cleveland had taught him how to live without attention, and college only reinforced the lesson. Each game passed like a silent affirmation that he was good enough, but each season's end was a voiceless denial from the outside world. No long articles, no features, no whispers that this kid could go far. Oakley began to understand that if he kept waiting for recognition, he'd stay stuck in place forever. So he stopped expecting it. He played not to be loved, but to survive. It was in that environment that Oakley formed a bitter but realistic philosophy: value doesn't guarantee recognition. You can do everything right, sacrifice everything, but the world has no obligation to notice you. That lesson didn't make him bitter, but it made him cold toward expectations. He no longer dreamed of bright lights, no longer imagined the moment of being called up in glory. Instead, he focused on the only thing he could control: toughness and discipline. Oakley's college years passed that way, quietly but heavily. He had no memories of big celebration nights or lengthy interviews. What he carried away was a body growing ever tougher, and a mindset growing ever more closed off. He got used to doing the heaviest work without thanks, used to standing in the shadows so others could step into the light. And from there a dangerous instinct took shape: if no one needs me, I still have to stand firm. Virginia Union didn't give Oakley fame, but it forged in him the ability to endure invisibility. While others sought validation from the outside world, Oakley learned to exist without it. That is strength, but also pain. Because the more accustomed you become to not being named, the easier it is to accept being forgotten. Oakley didn't know that this habit would follow him his whole life, from college to the NBA, from the peak to leaving the court. At Virginia Union, he proved he was good enough to stand firm, but he also learned a cruel truth in this world. Some people build the foundation for everything, yet never stand on the podium of glory. And Charles Oakley, from very early on, understood that he might be one of them. From the silence of Virginia Union, stepping into the NBA wasn't a rise to glory, but a straight slide into the merciless grinder of professional basketball, where Charles Oakley quickly understood that talent was no longer the central story. The day his name was called in the draft should have been a life-changing moment, but for Oakley, that joy lasted only a flash, because almost immediately, he was traded. No explanation, no long-term plan, just a cold administrative decision. The message was crystal clear: you're not the future, you're movable property. When Oakley put on the Chicago Bulls jersey, he didn't step into a family or a collective built around people. He stepped into a machine running to create stars. And in that machine, Oakley wasn't seen as a player with dreams and limits. but as a necessary tool to protect the most valuable thing. The Bulls didn't need Oakley to shine, they needed him to stand in the way. No need to score, no need to be named, just tough enough to take hits for someone else. In the NBA, everything moved faster, harder, and more ruthlessly than any environment Oakley had ever known. Collisions weren't just a release anymore, they were assigned duties. Falls weren't accidents, they were the inevitable result of the role. Oakley was taught, through actions not words, that his value lay in his ability to endure. When Michael Jordan drove to the basket, Oakley had to be the one ready to face swinging arms, flying elbows, violent challenges. Violence became the language of survival, the only way to prove he belonged on that floor. No one asked Oakley how he felt. No one stopped to consider the price his body was paying. In that world, his silence was taken as consent. Oakley learned fast that the NBA doesn't reward loyalty, but punishes weakness. Hesitate and you're out. React slowly, and you're replaced. So he chose the only path that could keep him alive, become indispensable in the role no one else wanted. Every game, he dove into collisions most players avoided. Every time he got up after a fall, he sent a wordless message that he was still useful. But that usefulness had a dark side. It locked him into the image of an enforcer, someone only remembered when protection was needed, and forgotten as soon as he no longer fit the long-term plan. There was no room for romance in Oakley's early NBA years. The locker room didn't talk about dreams, it talked about assignments. The court wasn't a place for self-expression, it was a battlefield where every minute played could shorten a career. Oakley accepted that, not because he loved violence, but because he understood it was the price to avoid being pushed out. His body began showing the first signs of wear, aching shoulders, tight back, knees grinding after every game. But those pains weren't seen as reasons to stop, they were just proof he was doing his job right. In that machine, Oakley wasn't asked what kind of player he wanted to be. The role was preset, and any resistance was pointless. He learned to accept that recognition, if it came, would arrive late and incomplete. Teammates knew he mattered, but the outside world didn't. Stats didn't tell the full story, and quiet sacrifices were rarely replayed on TV. Oakley stood on the fragile line between essential and replaceable, where one tactical change or management decision could erase his spot. It was in that context that violence stopped being a choice and became the only language for Oakley to assert his existence. Every collision was an answer to the question the NBA never asked outright: do you deserve to be here? Oakley answered by standing firm, by never backing down, by letting his body absorb blows for others. But beneath that hard shell, a truth slowly formed: if your value is measured only by how much punishment you can take, then one day, when you can't take it anymore, you'll have no value left. Oakley didn't know when that day would come, but he began to feel the fragility of his position. The NBA gave him a chance to survive, but in return, it demanded he pay with his body and identity. And once that grinder started, it wouldn't stop just because one man had done everything asked of him. In the merciless grinder of the NBA, where value is measured by instant efficiency and replacement is always waiting, the relationship between Charles Oakley and Michael Jordan formed not from promises, but from the brutal reality of the court. Jordan was the Chicago Bulls' most precious asset, the future the entire organization bet on. And to protect that future, the Bulls needed someone willing to stand between Jordan and the league's violence. Oakley became that person. No contract spelled it out, no long explanations needed. His role was established through actions. When Jordan drove to the rim, Oakley had to be there, ready to take every hit for the young teammate. Loyalty, in this case, wasn't a moral concept, it was a duty assigned in silence. Oakley protected Jordan with his own body. Every collision, every time he stepped in front of swinging arms, every scuffle that didn't make the stat sheet was part of an unspoken deal. When opponents tried to provoke Jordan, Oakley was the one who responded. When the game got heated and violence escalated, Oakley took the blame. He got labeled aggressive, seen as the troublemaker, watched closely by referees. But all of it was accepted as the price to let Jordan play freely. Oakley didn't score much, didn't appear in flashy highlights, but he was present in every moment Jordan needed space to grow. That sacrifice came with no public thanks, no tribute ceremonies, no long interviews about Oakley's importance in the Bulls' early years. Stats didn't tell the story of the pushes, the screens, the times he stood in front of violence. Oakley existed in the shadows of history, where the most essential contributions are the least mentioned, but he didn't complain. Cleveland and Virginia Union had taught him that waiting for recognition is a dangerous game. He chose silence and fulfilled his role, believing loyalty, even unrecognized, still had its own worth. Yet the NBA doesn't run on eternal values. As Jordan became the absolute center, as the Bulls began envisioning a different team, faster, more fluid, less physical, Oakley's loyalty started to feel inconvenient. The irony was that what once made him indispensable, his toughness, his readiness to confront, his take-the-hits role, now made him seem unfit. The era changed, and in that change, loyalty was downgraded to an exchangeable variable. When Oakley was put on the trading block, there was no long conversation about the years he had sacrificed. No one recalled the times he stepped up to protect Jordan, the times he absorbed violence so others could stay safe. The decision was made neatly, coldly, like a necessary calculation for the team's future. To the organization, it was a strategic move. To Oakley, it was the first time he clearly felt that loyalty wasn't a two-way commitment. He had given everything he had, but when he no longer fit, he could be replaced without explanation. Oakley's pain wasn't in being traded. He understood the NBA as a business. The pain was in how his sacrifices were reduced to a single transaction line. No acknowledgement that Jordan's growth had once been shielded by his body. No moment to pause and recognize the price he had paid. Oakley left the Bulls carrying the familiar feeling from childhood, doing it all but never being named. The only difference this time was that he was no longer an anonymous kid. He was an NBA player who had sacrificed most of his body for the team. It was at this breaking point that the tragedy of sacrifice became clear. Oakley wasn't betrayed in a dramatic sense. He was discarded in the most orderly and logical way a system could manage. That made the pain cut deeper, because there was no one to blame, no scandal to cling to, just the naked truth that in this world, loyalty only has value while it's useful. Oakley didn't lash out publicly, didn't try to rewrite the story. He kept moving forward, carrying a bitter lesson. You can protect an entire icon, but nothing guarantees that the icon, or the system around it, will protect you back. And from that moment, Charles Oakley's path entered a new chapter, where he remained true to his way of living, but no longer naive enough to believe that loyalty would be reciprocated. If Chicago was where Charles Oakley learned to sacrifice in silence, then New York was where he learned to bring that sacrifice into the light without needing justification. When Oakley put on the New York Knicks jersey, he didn't just join a team. He stepped into an identity, a philosophy forged in collisions, bitterness, and the unyielding pride of that city. The Knicks of the 90s didn't play to look pretty. They played to survive. Every game was a battle for space, honor, and the right to exist in a hostile Eastern Conference. In that world, Oakley didn't need to learn how to become an icon. He already embodied that spirit perfectly. No flash, no boasting, no apologies for his toughness. Oakley stepped onto the court like it was the only place he belonged. New York saw in him what they always respected, a man willing to pay with his body to keep an unspoken promise. Those years the Knicks were built like an army. Every position had a mission, and Oakley's mission was to keep the team standing when everything turned chaotic. He was the path clearer, the shield, the one diving into battles others avoided. When the game heated up, Oakley got hotter. When opponents tried to disrupt the flow, Oakley was the one who answered. Not because he loved violence, but because he understood New York didn't respect hesitation. This city loved those who never backed down, and Oakley gave them that every night. Fans loved him for that toughness, for the reassurance of knowing there was always someone on the floor ready to protect teammates at any cost. But that same toughness also made Oakley a fearsome figure, a shadow that made opponents wary and referees watchful. New York's love always came with fear, and Oakley accepted both as part of the price he had to pay. In the most intense games, when the stands shook with screams and hostility spilled across every inch of the hardwood, Oakley was the emotional anchor. He didn't need to score 30 points to be recognized. He just needed to stand firm in the paint, just needed to never back down from any challenge. Teammates looked to him for stability, to know that no matter how far the game went, there was still one person who wouldn't let things spiral out of control. But behind that image was a rarely mentioned truth. Every night that passed, Oakley's body paid the price. His shoulders ached, his back stiffened, his knees creaked after every landing. The pain didn't come as accidents. It accumulated bit by bit like debt that was never cleared. And New York, in its thirst for victory, never stopped to ask how much longer Oakley could hold on. Oakley's emotional peak with the Knicks was also the beginning of the tragedy. He was loved for his durability, for his seemingly endless capacity to endure, and so people simply assumed he would always be there. Each season that passed, expectations rose, intensity never eased. The Knicks didn't need Oakley healthy, they needed Oakley present, and he was present, game after game, carrying bruises that never fully healed. No one tracked how many times he got up after a fall. No one counted the collisions that left him dazed for a moment before he kept going. Those moments never showed up in the stat sheet, but they were the foundation for every team's success. New York loved Oakley by piling more on his shoulders than any human should carry. That love wasn't gentle, wasn't protective, it demanded. And Oakley answered with silence, because he was used to loving without being preserved. But deep in those years a quiet truth grew. No system can sustain itself forever on the sacrifice of a body wearing down day by day. Oakley felt it every morning when he woke up, when standing straight took longer, when the pain lingered longer than before. Yet the Knicks never stopped. Season followed season, war followed war, and Oakley kept stepping onto the court as if there were no other choice. It was in New York that Oakley reached the height of belonging, but also lost the most. He became the spiritual icon of an era, but the price was his body and part of his future. The love he received was real, but it wasn't enough to stop the irreversible erosion. When the final buzzer sounded, and the stands slowly emptied, Oakley left the floor with pains he never shared. That was the paradox of New York's love, passionate to the point of frenzy, but never pausing to protect. And in that paradox, Charles Oakley's tragedy began to take clearer shape, not through one dramatic collapse, but through hundreds of consecutive nights, when his body silently bore the burden while the team and the city marched forward. The summer of 1994 arrived in New York unlike any before. This city had waited too long, endured too many bitter years, and when the New York Knicks stepped into the NBA Finals, the feeling was no longer hope, it was a near-desperate demand. This wasn't just a championship series. It was the moment to prove that all the blood, sweat and years of unrelenting war finally meant something. For Charles Oakley, the finals weren't a glittering peak, they were the final test of a body worn down over many seasons. He entered that series, not with youthful vigor, but with stiff knees every morning, lingering back pain, and wounds that never truly healed. But no one asked Oakley how he felt. The finals didn't wait for emotions, it only accepted presence. The opponent was the Houston Rockets, a cold, precise collective that cared nothing for side stories. Every game was an unforgiving tug-of-war with no room for mistakes or hesitation. Oakley played with whatever body remained, with instincts forged from Cleveland, from Virginia Union, from those early collision-filled NBA years. He dove into battles, stood firm in the paint, absorbed hits most players wouldn't take. There were no highlights for those things, no slow-motion replays for the pushes that dazed him for a second before he rose again. The finals didn't record endurance, it only recorded results. As each game passed, intensity never dropped, and Oakley's body rebelled more fiercely. Mornings before games grew heavier, warm-ups took longer, every sprint required more effort. But he still took the floor, because in the world of the 90s Knicks, not showing up was close to betrayal. Fans saw Oakley as the icon of toughness, and icons aren't allowed to look tired. Teammates relied on him to hold the game's rhythm, to make sure nothing spun out of control. And Oakley did it, time after time, even as the price grew steeper. As the series deepened, and New York's hopes hung by a thread game by game, Oakley began to realize an unbearable truth. No matter how much he sacrificed, no matter how many collisions he stood firm against, nothing guaranteed it would be enough. The finals didn't care about a history of sacrifice. It only cared about who won 4 games first. And when the Knicks fell, when the trophy slipped away in silence, that defeat wasn't just a loss on the court. It was the moment Oakley understood that every sacrifice, no matter how sincere, could become meaningless in the face of the final result. No one stopped to ask Oakley how much it hurt. After the final buzzer, the story quickly shifted to tactical breakdowns, stats, decisions to review for next season. The pains in Oakley's body didn't make the papers. No one wrote about the nights he couldn't sleep because his back throbbed, about how every sit-down or stand-up took a few extra seconds to regain balance. The finals ended, and New York looked to the future. Oakley, meanwhile, carried a heavier emptiness than any bruise. The 1994 loss didn't destroy Oakley instantly. It did something crueler. It planted a slow-burning doubt that everything he had done might never be repaid. No ring, no final moment of glory, just memories of games where he left pieces of his body on the hardwood. And the most painful part wasn't losing the title, it was realizing the system would keep running as if nothing had happened. The Knicks would find a way back, the NBA would move to a new season, and Oakley, with a heavy body and a mind full of questions, would have to face alone the truth that sacrifice doesn't guarantee meaning. After the finals, there was no pause for healing, no real time to recover. The next season arrived, expectations piled back on his shoulders, and Oakley stepped onto the court again. But from that point, a crack had appeared. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but it was there, quietly eating away at the faith Oakley once had in the value of sacrifice. He still played, still fought, still held his role, but inside, something had changed. The 1994 finals had taught him that some efforts are never justly rewarded, and some people leave the game carrying more scars than any ring. Looking back, 1994 wasn't just a failed year in the career file. It was the moment Oakley first touched the limits of belief. Belief that if you gave enough, the world would give back. The finals shattered that belief cruelly but quietly, and from the ashes of that hope, Charles Oakley's tragedy moved into a new, deeper, darker phase, where every next step faced not just opponents on the court, but the unspoken question, if every sacrifice isn't enough, then what is left to hold on to? After 1994, what changed wasn't just one season passing, it was the entire moral structure of the NBA. What was once seen as grit gradually became viewed as risk. What was once respected gradually got labeled outdated. Rules softened, collisions drew stricter calls, game pace sped up, and basketball transformed into a TV-friendly entertainment product. In that shift, Charles Oakley suddenly found himself out of place. The qualities that once helped him survive and be loved, toughness, readiness to confront, unconditional loyalty, were now seen as issues to manage. No one said it outright, but the message grew clearer. The NBA no longer needed players like Oakley. This change didn't happen overnight. It seeped into every decision, every meeting, every wary glance from referees and management. Collisions once viewed as competitive spirit now became technical fouls. Reactions once seen as protecting teammates now interpreted as disruptive behavior. Oakley felt the difference every time he stepped on the floor. The margin for error shrank, tolerance vanished. He didn't change his style of play, because that wasn't a habit that could be quickly adjusted. It was how he survived. But that very refusal to change marked him. In a league moving toward a polished image, Oakley became an uncomfortable reminder of an era the NBA was trying to leave behind. Entertainment basketball demanded easy-to-tell stories, marketable faces, moments that could be edited into commercials. Oakley fit none of those criteria. He didn't talk much, didn't play the media hero role, didn't apologize for his toughness, and so he was gradually pushed to the edge. Roles diminished, minutes shortened, subtle reminders that the team needed to be more flexible. Loyalty, the thing that once was the foundation, was now seen as a burden, because loyalty meant refusing to bend to the new strategy. The most painful part wasn't that Oakley was no longer favored, it was the way this shift denied everything he had given. No acknowledgement that players like him had kept the NBA standing through its harshest years. No gentle transition for men, forged in collisions. Instead, an unspoken message: the era has changed, and if you don't change with it, you'll be left behind. Oakley understood that, but understanding didn't mean acceptance. He didn't know how to become a different version of himself just to fit in. Those subsequent team changes carried the familiar feeling of impermanence. Wherever Oakley went, he was respected in the locker room, but rarely built into long-term plans. He became a short-term fix for immediate problems, more toughness, more stability, but not the answer for the future that teams wanted to promote. Each new contract was shorter, each role more faded. Oakley was no longer the central icon. He was a necessary but easily replaceable piece. And in that process, a paradox formed. The man once loved for never backing down was now shunned for exactly that. Oakley's body also reflected the era's change. Accumulated injuries were no longer seen as proof of dedication, but as medical risks. Every lingering pain became a reason for management to consider alternatives. But Oakley had no other language for survival besides endurance. He kept taking the floor, kept doing what he had always done, while the world around him demanded the opposite. That disconnect left him increasingly isolated, not because of a lack of teammates, but because of a lack of a system that still understood his value. As the NBA changed its face, Oakley wasn't given the chance to adapt gradually. He was judged by new standards he had no part in building. And in those standards, loyalty wasn't an asset. Loyalty was seen as rigid, hard to manage, an obstacle to image. Oakley became a living example of a generation being phased out, the men who helped the league grow up, but who were no longer welcome when the league wanted a makeover. That pushing aside didn't come with a clear ending moment. No farewell ceremony, no full tribute, just a gradual dimming, like stage lights fading bit by bit. Oakley saw it, and understood that this war couldn't be won with collisions. You can't beat an era with muscle, and so he kept moving forward, carrying a familiar bitterness. He had done everything asked of him, but it still wasn't enough to hold his place. The NBA marched on with a new rhythm, new faces, new stories, and Oakley, once an icon of an era, gradually became an inconvenient memory, not because he was wrong, but because he no longer fit. And in that exclusion, Charles Oakley's tragedy gained another layer, not the tragedy of failure, but the tragedy of being overtaken by time, while the values he represented, loyalty, endurance, honor, remained intact but found no place. When Charles Oakley left the NBA, there was no clear boundary to mark the moment, no farewell ceremony, no honor night, no highlight reel of the collisions that once shook the league. His career didn't close with applause, but with a suffocating silence. One day the buzzer no longer called his name. The flights, the locker rooms, the familiar rhythm of the season, all vanished overnight, leaving a man standing in emptiness, carrying a scarred body, but no role to bear. Retirement for Oakley wasn't rest, it was free fall. For 2 decades, his identity had been tied to a very clear mission: stand in the way, take the hits, keep order, protect teammates. When that mission was taken away, the question hit immediately: who is he without the hardwood, without the screams, without the nightly battles? The values that once kept him alive, discipline, endurance, loyalty, suddenly had no use. The outside world didn't need a man ready to sacrifice his body for others. It needed different skills, different words, a different image. And Oakley, who had never learned to perform himself, became lost. No ritual also meant no transition process. No one guided Oakley out of the warrior role into ordinary life. Mornings woke without practice schedules, without travel plans, without short-term goals to cling to. His body still hurt the same, stiff back, aching knees, but now that pain had no justification from purpose. Before, pain was the price for team wins. Now pain was just pain, and that difference eroded his spirit faster than any injury. Oakley was used to noise, not the glamorous noise of stardom, but the noise of collisions, of conflict, of constant pressure. When that noise disappeared, the silence became terrifying. It exposed voids he had never had to face: loneliness, lack of recognition, the feeling of being abandoned. The people who once needed him on the court were busy with new plans. The NBA kept moving forward, seasons passed, and Oakley realized that in this world, memory has an expiration date, not because he didn't deserve it, but because the wheel doesn't stop for anyone. Identity collapse is a slow, quiet process. It arrives in small moments, watching a game on TV and not seeing himself in it anymore, reading the papers, and realizing his name is no longer mentioned, walking into a room and no longer getting the wary looks once reserved for the enforcer. Oakley used to be someone opponents had to account for. Now he was someone who had to wonder if he still counted at all. That shift wasn't fair, but it was reality. And that reality forced Oakley to face the hardest thing, learning to exist without a predefined role. No tribute wasn't just the absence of a ceremony, it was the absence of acknowledgement that what he did had value beyond its time. Oakley didn't demand praise, but the prolonged silence sent a cold message. Your era is over, and we've moved on to a different story. For a man who grew up in deprivation, accustomed to being left behind, that message struck an old wound. It revived the feeling from Cleveland, from Virginia Union, from the early NBA years, doing it all but never being named. The man accustomed to taking hits now had no place to stand guard, no one left to protect, no battle to enter. But the habit of endurance didn't vanish with the career. It stayed, turning into a mental burden. Oakley had to learn to redirect the energy once used for physical violence into a different fight, the fight to hold himself together when every familiar structure had dissolved. He wasn't taught how to let go, he was only taught how to keep going. And in this phase, going without knowing where was the hardest thing. The silence after retirement also exposed a bitter paradox. The NBA once needed Oakley because he did the things no one else wanted to do. But when those things no longer fit the new image, the man who did them was left behind without commensurate thanks. This wasn't just one man's story, it was the story of an entire generation, but Oakley felt it at the most personal level, in every morning he woke up, in every pain that no longer had collective meaning, and yet Oakley didn't collapse completely. He was angry, bitter, but he didn't disappear. The silence didn't kill him. It tested him in a different way. When the noise vanished overnight, what remained was a man forced to redefine himself, not by what he could endure, but by who he would become when no one needed him to endure for them. This was the most dangerous emptiness in Oakley's life, not because of a lack of glory, but because of a lack of direction. And it was in that emptiness that his tragedy moved into a new chapter, deeper, lonelier, where the question was no longer are you strong enough, but who are you when you're no longer called. Some days don't kill a man outright, but completely destroy how the world sees him, and how he sees himself. February 8, 2017 was one of those days for Charles Oakley. It wasn't the day he failed on the court, wasn't the day his body gave out from injury, it was the day he was pushed out of the very history he helped build. Madison Square Garden, the place that once roared for his collisions, the place that once saw him as the spiritual icon of the New York Knicks, suddenly became the stage for a public humiliation no one was prepared to witness. Oakley returned to MSG that day, not as a challenger, not to draw attention. He returned as someone who once belonged there, as a veteran stepping back into his old fortress. No intent to cause trouble, no statements. Just a man wanting to sit down, watch a game, breathe in the atmosphere that had once been part of his blood. But history didn't welcome him. Instead of respect for an old icon, Oakley was met with suspicious eyes, a short exchange, an unclear tension, and everything escalated at a merciless speed. What happened next wasn't a normal argument between a fan and security. Oakley was approached as a threat. Arms grabbed him. Instinctive resistance appeared, the reflex of a man who had lived his whole life in collisions. But that reflex, in this context, became evidence against him. He was dragged through the aisles, in front of thousands of eyes. No private space, no minimal discretion. A man who once protected an entire team was now treated like a troublemaker to be removed as quickly as possible. The image of Oakley in handcuffs, being led out of MSG, spread rapidly. No commentary needed. The image alone was devastating. It didn't just capture a security incident, it captured the moment history was denied. To younger fans it might have looked like an old player causing trouble, but to those who understood who Oakley was, it was an unacceptable scene, an icon having his dignity broken right where it had once been honored. That dignity wasn't just personal honor, it was the honor of an entire generation of players who built the Knicks with blood and endurance. What made this incident so destructive wasn't Oakley's arrest, but the message it sent, the message that history can be discarded if it no longer fits the current narrative, the message that loyalty, once it loses commercial value, can be treated as a nuisance. Oakley wasn't just ejected from a game, he was ejected from the official memory of the place he once gave everything to. MSG, the Knicks symbol, told him without words that he no longer belonged there. After the incident, explanations were offered, legal statements, neutral news reports, carefully worded phrases, but none were enough to erase the image etched deep into the public mind. Oakley wasn't protected by his legacy. There was no pause for explanation, no respect for the past. It all happened too fast, too public, too coldly. For a man accustomed to taking hits on the court, this blow was different. It didn't come from an opponent, but from the very place that once called him family. Oakley's reaction afterward wasn't soft. He was angry, bitter, and direct. But that anger wasn't that of a troublemaker. It was the cry of someone who felt betrayed. He spoke about the lack of respect, about how history was treated like a burden, and no matter which side of the argument you stand on, one thing can't be denied. Oakley was put in an unfair position. No one asked how he felt being dragged away in public. No one asked a man who had sacrificed his entire career for the Knicks how he deserved to be treated when he came back. The MSG incident in 2017 did what many years of retirement hadn't. It completely shattered the remaining bond between Oakley and the Knicks organization. If there had still been hope for reconciliation, for a belated tribute, that hope was nearly crushed after that day. Oakley didn't just lose his place in the present, he lost the right to be remembered with dignity. His history was left hanging, never fully denied, but never embraced either. For Oakley, this was the peak of a long chain of being phased out, from being pushed aside by the era, to retiring in silence, and now being publicly humiliated. MSG 2017 wasn't an isolated incident, it was the inevitable result of how the system treats people who no longer fit, and because of that it carried cruel symbolism. It showed that in the world of sports entertainment, memory only exists when it's profitable. That day, Oakley left MSG not just with handcuffs on his wrists, but with a deeper mental wound than any physical injury he had ever endured. It was the wound of rejection, of being turned into an outsider in his own life story. And as the MSG doors closed behind him, one thing became clear. Charles Oakley's tragedy was no longer the tragedy of a forgotten player, but the tragedy of a history treated like an obstacle to be removed. From that moment, the question wasn't what Oakley had done wrong, but whether the world was ready to confront how it treats the people who built its very foundation. After the night he was dragged out of Madison Square Garden, the world didn't stop to ask if Charles Oakley was okay. News moved on, the season continued, new debates took over the airwaves, and Oakley entered another phase of life. No noise, no court, just the lingering aftermath of a blow to his dignity. The MSG incident didn't end with the handcuffs. It opened a stretch of days where honor wasn't protected, where every attempt at explanation fell into the cold void of procedure and public opinion. Lawsuits began as a reflex of self-defense, not to win or lose, but to reclaim the right to be seen fairly. Files, complaints, drawn-out legal timelines, dry and emotionless. Every step forward in the courtroom was a step back in his mental life. Oakley had to relive the memory of that very day, had to hear others retell his story in the numb language of records. In those lines, there was no room for context, for history, for the years he paid for with his body. Only incident, subject, measures, honor. The thing he had guarded his whole life had no box to fill. The media, accustomed to a fast rhythm, was cold. News was framed in neat headlines, sometimes sensational, rarely asking deeper questions. Oakley was portrayed more as a controversial figure than as a man in pain. Half-hearted comments appeared. Some called him stubborn. Others said he deserved to be kicked out. Very few stopped to ask why an icon of an era could be treated that way, right where he had once been honored. The complexity of history was reduced to a few minutes of airtime. And in that reduction, Oakley was left behind. Oakley didn't apologize, not because he didn't understand the weight of the incident, but because apologizing would mean accepting a role he refused, the role of the senseless troublemaker. Throughout his career, he had never apologized for standing in the way, for taking hits, for doing what needed to be done to protect teammates. Now was no different. He didn't bow his head to trade for fake peace. That decision made the path lonelier, but it was the price he was used to paying. For Oakley, apologizing to be forgiven, while his honor was broken, would be a betrayal of himself. The loneliness after MSG was deeper than the poverty of his youth. Back then, poverty had a goal: survive, rise, prove. Now loneliness had no compass. Calls grew sparse. Promises of support became vague. Some chose silence to avoid involvement. Others advised him to let it go. But how do you let it go when the image of being dragged still hangs in your mind? How do you move past when your own history is treated like an obstruction? Oakley lived with that question every day. The psychological aftermath wasn't loud like a collapse. It came in small moments, stepping into a crowded space and feeling the looks change, hearing someone mention MSG and feeling his heart suddenly weigh heavy, wondering if loyalty still had value in a world that measured everything by image. Oakley didn't talk much about the sleepless nights, about the anger with nowhere to go, but those close to him understood this wound didn't heal quickly. It reached the root, the feeling of being abandoned that had followed him since childhood. During that time, Oakley chose to keep his voice the same, direct, unadorned, without permission. He spoke about respect, about history, about how people can't be treated like risks to eliminate. Those words weren't to win back goodwill, they were to hold the line. But holding that line left him standing alone longer, because in the post-MSG world, softness was rewarded, and toughness was seen as a problem. Oakley understood that, but he didn't change how he existed. The lawsuits dragged on, and eventually closed, without the relief people might imagine. The law could close the file, but it couldn't close the feeling of rejection. The media moved to other stories, leaving Oakley with the rest, a thicker, heavier silence. He didn't seek pity. What he wanted, and didn't receive, was acknowledgement that what happened was wrong, that history deserved at least minimal respect. After MSG, Oakley learned a bitter lesson: honor, if not protected by a community, can be distorted in just a few minutes. And when that happens, the person carrying the honor must hold on to it himself, even if it costs him loneliness. He kept living, kept speaking, kept standing tall, not because he hoped for image rehabilitation, but because it was the only way not to lose himself. This phase brought no climax or neat ending. It was a long stretch of quiet endurance. Oakley walked through it not with victory, but with steadfastness. And that very steadfastness, not apologizing for what he didn't believe was wrong, was what kept him true to himself, even as the world turned its back. After MSG, when honor wasn't protected, Oakley became lonelier than ever. But from that loneliness, he also became clearer than ever about the one thing left: to hold on to his own truth, even if it made the path narrower and darker. After MSG, when the outside world grew cold and left no room for explanation, Charles Oakley retreated to the one place that demanded nothing from him: family. No lights, no microphones, no trap questions. There no one mentioned fame, and no one counted what he had given or what was left. Oakley's family had always been as private as the man himself, rarely appearing in the media, never trying to tell their story for sympathy. They existed like a silent fortress, walls built not with words but with presence. For Oakley, it was a fragile breathing space, not full healing, but a safe enough space to not be judged. At home he wasn't the Knicks icon, wasn't the man dragged from MSG, wasn't the controversial figure. He was just a husband, a father, a brother, roles without stat sheets, without audiences. That very normalcy, after a lifetime defined by collisions and expectations, was both a lifeline and a challenge. Because Oakley was more used to taking hits than to speaking them out, family didn't ask him to recount that day at MSG. They didn't force him to act okay. Care came in a very Oakley way: quiet, steady, unshowy. A meal without too many questions, an evening without sports on TV, a nod instead of long conversation. There Oakley didn't have to brace himself to stand firm, but precisely because he didn't have to brace, he realized something harder: he didn't know how to express. The years of learning to endure had taught him to bottle every emotion, to the point that when he needed to open up he fumbled. Family was the only place Oakley didn't need to prove his worth, and also the place where he lacked the skill to show softness. He could stand in front of any opponent, but he was awkward with simple questions. Are you tired? Are you okay? Those questions had no referees, no rules, no plays to rely on. Oakley often answered with silence or a short phrase, because that was the language he knew, and family understood that. They didn't push, they let him be present in his own way. In those quiet days, Oakley began facing what his entire career had helped him avoid: the feeling of being lost. With no more games to prepare for, no more role to protect, his mind was forced to stare straight into the void. Family didn't fill that void with advice. They just stood there, like solid ground so he wouldn't fall deeper. Sometimes salvation doesn't come from being fully understood, but from not being required to explain. Oakley learned to be present in small ways. Picking up the kids, fixing something minor around the house. Those seemingly trivial things brought back a sense of usefulness he had lost after retirement. No applause, but necessity. No crowds, but trust. Family gave him a different definition of value, not based on violence or endurance, but on simply being there. For a man once loved for his toughness, this was the hardest lesson. Even so, family wasn't a magic cure. The long nights still came. The MSG memories still returned, sometimes without warning. Oakley had moments when he withdrew into deeper silence, afraid that if he opened his mouth, the anger and sadness would spill out uncontrollably. Family noticed and chose patience. They didn't demand quick change. They understood wounds don't heal on a broadcast schedule. In that final fortress, Oakley didn't find praise, but he found acceptance. No one there saw his toughness as a burden, and no one asked him to become someone else. And that quiet acceptance helped him hold on to the most precious thing after all the upheaval: the feeling that he still belonged somewhere. Even as the world outside closed its doors, family left the door open, not loudly, no signs, just a light bright enough for him to find his way home. For Oakley, family wasn't the place of complete healing. It was the place where he wasn't destroyed further. A fragile but necessary breathing space, so a man who had spent his life standing guard for others could set the burden down for a moment. There, he didn't have to prove his worth. And even though he didn't know how to express, his silence was heard. In the post-MSG world, where honor had once been broken, family became the last fortress, not to fight back, but to survive. After all the noise had died, after history turned its back, and family became the last fortress, Charles Oakley's tragedy no longer took the form of arguments or public humiliation. It returned to the place that had borne the most throughout his life: his body. No noise, no drama, no witnesses, just persistent, unrelenting pain, like a reminder that no sacrifice disappears without leaving consequences. Chronic pain didn't arrive like a single blow. It accumulated, layered, quietly taking over every movement. Knees, that had absorbed thousands of landings, creaked every time Oakley stood up. Back, once enduring paint battles, stiffened like cold metal every morning. Shoulders, that had supported an entire defensive system, ached when he reached for something ordinary. Those pains needed no introduction. They were there from the moment he opened his eyes. Every morning became a negotiation with his body, not the question what to do today, but how far can I go today. Oakley learned to measure the new day by the level of pain. More pain meant slowing down. Less pain meant going a little farther. No standard schedule, no long-term plans. Everything decided step by step, breath by breath. For someone who once lived by intensity and rhythm, this slowing was cruel. It forced him to face limits, not of will, but of flesh and bone. The most painful part wasn't the physical sensation, but the betrayal by the very tool that had once kept him alive. Oakley's body had been his most loyal ally, taking hits for him, standing firm when he needed it. Now, that ally turned its back, not out of malice, but because it had been drained dry. Pains appeared even without clear reason, a turn in bed at night, a step downstairs, a seemingly harmless bend. No opponent needed, no whistle, the body created its own battle. Oakley didn't complain. He never complained while playing, and he didn't start now. Endurance had become his default language, but that silence didn't mean less pain. It only meant the pain was kept inside, not shared. There were nights when pain stretched on, shattering sleep into short fragments. There were mornings when he had to sit still a few extra minutes just for his body to agree to stand. Those moments had no audience, no mental reward, just raw persistence. The biggest difference between pain during his playing days and pain after retirement was meaning. Before, pain was the price to protect teammates, to win, to get closer to collective goals. Now, pain served nothing beyond survival. It didn't bring Oakley closer to any trophy, didn't help anyone else shine. It was just there, like a due bill with no option to defer. That very meaninglessness made the pain heavier. The body's betrayal also brought new limits to his mental life. Oakley had to learn to say no to things he once did without thinking. Traveling far became a calculation. Sitting or standing too long came with a cost. Even simple joys, a walk, a light game, required consideration. For someone who once defined himself by endurance, accepting limits was the hardest lesson. It demanded a different kind of courage, the courage to prove nothing anymore. Even so, Oakley didn't surrender, not by defying the pain, but by managing it. He learned to listen to the smallest signals from his body, instead of ignoring them like before. That wasn't weakness, it was a new form of discipline, the discipline of survival. Each day no longer a win or lose battle, but an effort to keep things from getting worse. And in that effort, he still held on to the most important thing: dignity. No complaints, only endurance. That sounds like an old myth, but for Oakley, it was reality. He didn't use the pain to demand pity. He didn't turn it into a media story. Pain belonged to private life, where no cameras were. His silence wasn't denial of the pain, it was how he controlled it, not letting it define his entire being. At the end of this phase, the physical tragedy didn't conclude with a climactic moment. It continued, steady, like background music that never stops. But in that music, Oakley found a stark truth. Strength no longer lay in how many hits he could take, but in continuing to live meaningfully. When his body no longer cooperated, the body could betray, but the will, forged through a lifetime of endurance, still stood firm. And even though every morning was a negotiation, Oakley still stepped into the new day, no fanfare, no complaints, carrying the pains as the remaining part of the price he had accepted long ago. At age 62, Charles Oakley wasn't standing at a new crossroads. He stood in a dark present that had already taken full shape. No ambiguity, no promises, no redemption. The world he once belonged to had moved on without looking back. Doors didn't slam shut with noise, they closed with prolonged silence. Oakley knew his position clearly, standing outside, not because he lacked the conditions to return, but because he refused the only path that could bring him back, the path of an apology not rooted in belief. Oakley didn't apologize to be let back in, not because he didn't understand the power of an apology in the modern world, but because he understood the price. Apologizing, in his case, wasn't just admitting an action, it was accepting a story already written by others, a story that reduced history to incident, reduced a man to problem. Oakley couldn't sign his name to that story. All his life, he had lived by rough but consistent principles: stand in the way for others, take hits for the team, keep unspoken promises. If trading those principles for an honorary seat was required, then that seat held no meaning. Not bowing his head to be remembered, that choice made Oakley's present narrower and darker. He knew this. He knew that if he were just a little softer, spoke a little less, accepted the middle language of public relations, the door might crack open. But Oakley also knew that remembrance bought with a bowed head wasn't remembrance for the real him. It was only a smoothed version to fit the bigger picture. Oakley preferred to be truly forgotten, rather than remembered wrongly. At this age, loneliness was no longer a shock, it was the baseline state. Oakley lived with it like he lived with chronic pain. No complaints, no boasting. He didn't seek forgiveness, because he didn't believe he needed forgiveness for anything core. And he wasn't forgiven, because the system doesn't forgive those who refuse to bend. That uncompromising stance came from both sides, and Oakley accepted its price. Accepting being on the outside didn't mean abandoning himself. On the contrary, it was how Oakley kept himself from being erased. When you stand outside, you see the game's structure more clearly. You see who gets embraced, who gets pushed aside. You see how memories are selectively curated, how history gets polished. Oakley saw it all, and that seeing reinforced his choice. No compromise with a story that denies the value of sacrifice. Dignity became the last and most important thing he held. Not the dignity of a star, but the dignity of a man who didn't betray himself. That dignity needed no audience, no medals. It existed in the way Oakley said no to vague offers, in the way he kept his voice direct, even knowing it narrowed the path. At age 62, Oakley wasn't trying to rewrite the past. He was only refusing to let the past be rewritten by those who didn't live it. This dark present had no climax, no promise of reconciliation. It had a slow, steady, heavy rhythm. Days passed with physical pain, with MSG memories still unfaded, with the silence of places that once called themselves home. But in that rhythm, there was a cold stability. Oakley knew who he was. No more proving, no more protecting any role except the role of being human. Some people call it stubbornness, some call it making things hard on himself. Oakley calls it loyalty, not to an organization or an icon, but to himself. That loyalty once cost him his body. Now it costs him public presence. But Oakley accepts both, because he understands that the things that come easily are often the things that go easily. Dignity once lost has no way to be bought back. At age 62, Oakley doesn't stand on a stage to tell his life story. He stands in its shadow, holding on to the remaining pieces with bare hands. No forgiveness given, no forgiveness received. That isn't a defiant declaration, it's the reality. And in that reality, Oakley chooses the hardest but most honest way to exist, living without asking permission to be himself. This isn't a happy ending, it's a sober pause before the final part. A dark present where all illusions have fallen away, leaving only what can't be taken, real memories, real principles, and real dignity. Oakley holds them not to win against anyone, but to not lose to himself. At the close of this story, there is no victory to announce, no moment of reconciliation for the audience to exhale in relief. Charles Oakley didn't win history. History, as usual, chooses the ones easier to tell, easier to package, easier to turn into clean icons. Oakley doesn't fit that mold. He's too rough-edged, too direct, too hard to bend. And so history doesn't embrace him, it leaves him on the edge, where those who refuse to compromise are often placed. Oakley isn't forgiven, not because he doesn't deserve it, but because forgiveness in this world usually demands a ritual: bow at the right moment, say the right words, accept an edited version of the story. Oakley refuses that ritual. He doesn't apologize to be added back into the group photo, doesn't trade personal truth for an honorary seat. That keeps the door of reconciliation closed, not with a bang, not with statements, just not open. No reconciliation also means no neat conclusion, no tribute ceremony to erase the MSG memory, no official acknowledgement to patch the cracks. Oakley accepts that absence as a non-negotiable reality. He understands that some stories aren't retold with applause, but with prolonged silence. And that silence, cruel as it is more honest than any half-hearted apology. But amid everything Oakley doesn't have, no championship ring, no reconciliation, no embrace from history, he holds on to one thing that can't be taken: he never betrayed himself. He doesn't rewrite memories to make life easier, he doesn't smooth his edges to be accepted. He carries the scars, physical and mental, as proof of a life lived fully on his own terms. For Oakley, that isn't failure. It's the price of loyalty, loyalty to principles, to unspoken promises. Honoring Oakley can't be a round of applause, it has to be a silence. An acknowledgement without microphones that some men built the foundation for others' spotlight, kept the game standing through its harshest years, then walked away without matching rewards. Oakley belongs to that group. Men loved for their toughness when it was needed, then left behind when that toughness became inconvenient. In the pain and loneliness, Oakley keeps living, not waiting to be vindicated, but to keep his shape intact. Every morning is a negotiation with a betraying body. Every day is a passage through memories that refuse to sleep. But he walks through with his back straight, not because there's no pain, but because there's nothing left to prove. Oakley's greatness, if it exists, lies there, surviving without losing his identity. History may not embrace Oakley, but history also can't erase him. His name lives in the stories passed quietly, among those who understand how brutal this game once was. In the memories of teammates who felt safe knowing someone was standing guard. In the hearts of fans who loved New York for its raw truth, not its polished coat. That's an unofficial legacy. No plaque, no statue, but enduring. This ending brings no relief. It leaves a heavy feeling, true to the life Oakley lived. But that very heaviness forces us to look again at how we tell stories of greatness. Do we only applaud the winners and turn our backs on those who paid the price? Do we need stories that go down easy rather than truths that are hard to swallow? Oakley poses those questions not with words, but with his existence, standing outside, silent without permission. In this conclusion, honoring Oakley isn't saying he was perfect. He wasn't perfect. He was rough, stubborn, sometimes difficult, but he was real. And in a world that prefers polished versions, that realness is rare. Oakley didn't win history, but he also didn't let history win him. The story ends here, not with an embrace, but with a silence deep enough to understand that some men don't need to be embraced to be worthy of respect. They need to be looked at straight. Charles Oakley is one of them, and if history doesn't call his name with affection, we can do something simpler, harder. Remember him with quiet respect, and accept that some greatness exists only in pain, loneliness, and uncompromising loyalty. The story of Charles Oakley leaves a lingering ache rather than an explosive tragedy. It's not the pain of a man who lost on the court, but the pain of a human who sacrificed completely yet wasn't embraced by history. From a harsh childhood where Oakley learned to take hits before learning to dream, to the 90s New York Knicks years, he always took the role few wanted: stand in the way, absorb collisions, protect others. The peak was the 1994 NBA Finals, when Oakley played with whatever body remained, but defeat taught him a cruel lesson: sacrifice doesn't guarantee recognition. That tragedy grew more bitter in the 2017 Madison Square Garden incident, when Oakley, a spiritual icon of the Knicks, was dragged and handcuffed right where he had once been honored. That moment wasn't just a security incident, it was a denial of history, erasing thousands of collisions and years of loyalty. After that came drawn-out lawsuits, cold media, and a present where he accepts standing outside, refusing to apologize to return. His body betrays with chronic pain every morning, while family becomes the last fortress, the only place he doesn't have to prove his worth, even if it's also the place he doesn't know how to express. The lesson for Americans lies in that very silence. Society often honors winners and forgets those who built the foundation. Oakley reminds us that honor doesn't always come with rewards, and dignity sometimes remains only when we accept losing everything else. In real life, loyalty and endurance aren't always repaid, but refusing to betray yourself is the most enduring victory, even if it happens in pain and loneliness. If the story of Charles Oakley makes you pause and think about the value of honor, loyalty, and the price of quiet sacrifice, please subscribe to the channel to keep joining us in the next deep stories. Thank you for staying until the very end, and see you in the next video, where we continue looking straight at those fates history doesn't embrace but still deserve to be remembered.